A man shocks passengers when he refuses to let a black soldier travel in first class on his flight. But then this happens. James Smith was the typical young man who had everything at his disposal. The only son of powerful businessman Matthew Smith, he grew up surrounded by luxury and the certainty that the world revolved around him. From an early age, James was accustomed to having his wishes fulfilled without question, a privilege he never recognized as such. Always wearing designer clothes, driving luxury cars, and surrounded by a circle of friends who shared the same privileges, James believed that everything and everyone was at his service. "I am what I am because of my father, and people should respect me for that," he would often say, never hesitating to show his disdain for those he considered inferior. In school, James wasn't just an average student. He was the boy everyone feared to contradict. His arrogance was known to the teachers, but few dared to confront him. "My dad will fix this," was a common phrase whenever something didn't go his way. And indeed, Matthew Smith would solve it. Generous donations to the school ensured that any problem involving James would disappear quickly. Thus, he grew up believing that there was no mistake that couldn't be erased by the power of money and influence. When he reached adolescence, James began to explore the world with the same arrogance he had carried since childhood. International trips, exclusive parties, and a circle of friends formed by other rich and equally indifferent young people. In every city he visited, he made a point of being noticed. "This is my world," he would tell himself as he paraded through party halls, always with a smug smile on his face. He saw himself as someone above the rules, someone who didn't have to worry about the consequences of his actions. Despite all this, James had a deep contempt for those who didn't fit his ideal of success. To him, ordinary people were invisible, mere extras in his grand life. He would never waste time talking to someone he considered beneath him. "These people are like ants," he once said to a friend. "They're there, but they don't matter." It was this type of thinking that guided him and fed his distorted view of himself and the world. His relationship with his father, Matthew, was complex. Although James admired his father's power and influence, he also felt enormous pressure to live up to the family legacy. Matthew, in turn, saw James more as a reflection of his own greatness than as a son. "You need to be better than me," Matthew would say, expecting James to follow in his footsteps in the business world. But James didn't have the same work ethic. He wanted the rewards without having to sow the seeds, believing that the Smith surname was all he needed. At business meetings he was invited to, James always made a point of showing off his arrogance. He would interrupt discussions, dismiss others' opinions, and make sure to make it clear who he was. "I'm James Smith, and that's enough," he would repeat, whenever someone dared to question his ideas or behavior. His father's business partners, though often annoyed, swallowed James's arrogance in order to maintain good relations with Matthew. As he grew up in this environment of privilege and unrealistic expectations, James developed a deep need for affirmation. Everything was a status game to him, a constant competition to prove that he was the best, the most important, the most influential. He would spend hours on social media showcasing his luxurious life, hoping for thousands of likes that would reinforce his image of being someone enviable and unreachable. "These people would like to be like me, but they never will," he thought as he read the comments from his followers. However, behind all this facade of confidence and arrogance, James was a deeply insecure young man. He was obsessed with the opinion of others, always seeking external validation to fill the void left by a lack of true self-confidence. The parties, the trips, the material possessions were ways to hide his own weaknesses, but he would never admit that, not even to himself. Arrogance was his armor against the world, and he wore it with pride. But there was one thing James couldn't control: respect. He could buy people's silence, attention, and service, but true respect always eluded him. James was feared, but never admired. He surrounded himself with sycophants who reinforced his distorted vision, but he knew deep down that these people were only there for what he could offer. Even so, he preferred to keep up appearances, believing that respect was just another item on the list of things money could buy. In this world of superficiality and disdain, James was about to face an event that would completely change his perception of power and privilege. An unexpected encounter that, for the first time, would put him face to face with someone who wasn't willing to be subjugated by his arrogance. It was a sunny morning when James arrived at the airport, accompanied by his private driver. He walked with firm steps, his gaze always haughty, as if the world was there just to serve him. He was carrying only a small carry-on bag because, to him, anything else was unnecessary. Everything he needed would be provided in first class. James followed his usual protocol. No smile, no words of courtesy to the airport staff. He passed through the priority lines as though they were his natural right, ignoring any glance that might suggest disapproval. Upon boarding, James found his seat in first class, a place that for him symbolized his superiority. Always the best seat, he thought, as he settled in and opened his laptop without caring about what was happening around him. That was when he noticed Thomas, a young black soldier who, unlike the other passengers, was dressed in military attire. Thomas was seated in the same section, something that bothered James deeply. "But what is he doing here?" James muttered to himself, furrowing his brow. Thomas's presence seemed out of place in that environment, and James couldn't accept that someone like him, a simple soldier, could occupy the same space as people who, in James's eyes, were of a superior class. Without thinking twice, James stood up and walked toward the flight attendant, Jessica, who was organizing the preparations for the flight. "Can you explain to me why this soldier is in first class?" James asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Jessica, an experienced professional, immediately sensed James's intention and tried to keep her composure. "Sir, all passengers in this section have the right to be here, just like you," she responded calmly, trying to avoid a confrontation. "This is absurd," James exclaimed, raising his voice. "I pay a lot to be here, and I won't accept sharing this space with people like that," he added, not hiding his racist tone. Other passengers began to pay attention, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. Thomas, who had been observing everything from his seat, remained calm, not reacting to James's words. Jessica, seeing the situation escalate, tried to reason once more. "Sir, you need to understand that everyone here is equal. The soldier paid for his seat just like you," she explained, trying to make James understand the seriousness of his actions. But James wasn't willing to listen. He was used to getting what he wanted and wouldn't accept anything less now. "You don't know who you're talking to," James said, approaching Jessica. "I'm James Smith. My father is Matthew Smith, the greatest businessman in this country. Do you really think I'll accept this disrespect? Get this man out of here now," he demanded, pointing at Thomas with a dismissive gesture. The anger and contempt in his words were palpable, and Jessica could feel the weight of the hostility. Thomas, who had remained silent up until then, decided to stand up. He knew he was in his right to remain, but he didn't want the situation to become even more awkward for the other passengers and the crew. With a serene look, he approached James and spoke, maintaining the calm his military training had taught him. "Sir, if this bothers you so much, I can move to economy class. I only ask that you stop disrespecting the flight attendant and the rest of the crew," Thomas said, his voice firm but without aggression. Jessica tried to stop him. "You don't have to do this, sir. You're right, and he's completely wrong," she insisted, trying to protect the soldier from public humiliation. But Thomas smiled gently and shook his head. "I know I'm right, but I'm not here to fight. I just want everyone to be able to travel in peace," he replied, walking calmly toward economy class, even though he knew he was giving up something he shouldn't have had to. As Thomas moved away, James couldn't resist one last provocation. "That's right, you're all just here to obey. You should never be where you don't belong," he shouted, his voice full of hatred. The crew and passengers fell silent, shocked by the level of contempt James was displaying. Thomas, despite feeling deep anger, controlled himself and continued walking without looking back. Jessica, ashamed of the scene, went up to Thomas to apologize. "I'm sorry for this. He doesn't represent all of us," she said, with a sad expression. Thomas, with the calmness that characterized him, simply smiled. "You're not to blame. Some people only learn the hard way," he replied, not showing how much James's words had affected him. Before Jessica left, Thomas casually asked, "Do you know his full name?" Jessica, still shaken, answered promptly, "James Smith, son of Matthew Smith." Thomas nodded, thanked her for the information, and returned to his seat in economy class. The rest of the flight was tense in first class. The passengers avoided making eye contact with James, who, despite getting what he wanted, didn't seem satisfied. Sitting in his seat, he looked around as if searching for others' approval, but all he found were looks of disapproval and silent indignation. James, however, held firm to his belief that he was right and that the world should bend to his will. "These people don't understand who I am," he thought, irritated by the lack of support he expected to find. Meanwhile, in economy class, Thomas remained serene, but inside he reflected on what had happened. He was a dedicated soldier who had served his country with honor, and he never expected to face such a direct and humiliating attack from a civilian, especially someone who used his social status as a shield to justify his actions. "This can't go unchallenged," he thought, not out of revenge, but because actions like James's needed consequences. It was then that Thomas decided to use the flight time to contact his superiors. Using the onboard phone, he sent a detailed message reporting the incident and mentioning James Smith's name. He knew he wasn't just reporting a personal offense, but an act of racism and disrespect against a soldier on duty. "We must set an example, even in difficult situations," he wrote in the message, making it clear that he was willing to take the matter further if necessary. The response came almost immediately, and the serious tone of his superiors indicated that the matter would be treated with the gravity it deserved. When the plane landed, James was impatient, eager to leave and resume his life as if nothing had happened. But to his surprise, as soon as the aircraft doors opened, he was met with an unexpected sight. In the disembarkation hall, a team of police officers awaited, dressed in uniforms and with serious expressions. Two officers stepped toward the plane and boarded with firm steps. One of them, a robust man with a grave demeanor, approached James without hesitation. "James Smith?" he asked in a firm tone, attracting the attention of all the passengers who were still settling to exit. James, visibly confused, replied, "Yes, that's me. What's going on?" The officer continued, unfazed by James's attempt to maintain control of the situation. "You are being detained for a report of racist behavior and disrespect during this flight. The case has been documented by witnesses and is backed by recordings made by passengers and crew members." James's eyes widened, disbelief quickly turning to anger. "This is absurd. Who do you think you're dealing with? I'm James Smith, son of Matthew Smith," he said, raising his voice. He tried to resist the officer's firm grip, but was subdued with professionalism. "I demand to speak to my lawyer right now. This is a mistake." The passengers watched the scene with expressions of surprise and, in some cases, quiet satisfaction. Thomas, who remained at the back of the plane, watched with serenity, but also with the certainty that justice was being served. The soldier had decided to report the incident in detail, sending a message to the appropriate authorities right after disembarking. The police officers ignored James's protests and continued with their protocol. "You will have the opportunity to defend yourself, but for now, you must come with us," the officer declared. Amid murmurs and looks of disapproval, James was escorted off the plane and taken to the police vehicle parked on the tarmac. Jessica, the flight attendant who had been the target of James's disrespect, watched everything with a mixture of relief and discomfort. Although she felt that finally a limit had been imposed on the abusive behavior of the passenger, she knew that situations like this were rare to be resolved so clearly. She approached Thomas and thanked him. "You had the courage to do what many would have ignored. That's important." Thomas, with the same calm he maintained throughout the flight, responded, "Some people only learn from the consequences. I hope this makes him reflect." And so, while James was led to face the law like anyone else, Thomas and the other passengers left the airport with the sense that truth and respect had prevailed. At that moment, James finally realized that money and his family's influence couldn't protect him from everything. He was taken to a vehicle, still in shock, not fully understanding how his life had turned upside down in a matter of hours. "This is a nightmare," he thought. But the nightmare was real, and it was only just beginning. For the first time in his life, James was being treated like anyone else who broke the law. Jessica, the flight attendant who had been the target of James's disrespect, watched everything with a sense of relief mixed with sadness. She knew that situations like this were rarely punished, but she felt that this was an important step for such prejudiced and arrogant attitudes to no longer be tolerated. She looked at Thomas, who remained calm, and felt a deep respect for him, not only for his demeanor during the incident, but for the courage to face something that many would have simply ignored. The trial of James Smith became a major media event, drawing the attention of newspapers, television channels, and social media. Everyone wanted to know the outcome of a story that put the power of one of the country's most influential businessmen against the courage of a young soldier who, with serenity, had exposed the prejudice and arrogance of a spoiled heir. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Among the attendees were Thomas, Jessica, some of the passengers from the flight, and the press, all eager for justice. James entered the courtroom with a nervous demeanor, but still carrying that air of superiority. Beside him was his father, Matthew Smith, who had been using all his influence to try to protect his son since the incident. However, this time, the charges were too serious to be solved behind the scenes. James was accused of racism, humiliation against a soldier on duty, and disrespect to the crew, with recordings that proved every word and every gesture. The judge began the session, and after the formalities, Thomas was the first to be called to testify. Dressed in his impeccable military uniform, Thomas stood up with firm posture and walked to the witness stand. His gaze was calm, and he seemed immune to the pressure of being in front of so many people. "Tell us what happened on that flight," the judge asked, starting the testimony. Thomas, with a serene voice, recounted every detail, from James's first words to the moment he stood up to change seats. "Your Honor, I am a soldier. My job is to protect and serve. During the flight, Mr. James Smith made sure to remind me that, in his view, I didn't deserve to be where I was. He used offensive words, humiliated me for who I am, and treated the flight attendant with total disrespect. I gave up my seat, not because he was right, but because I wanted to preserve the peace for everyone there. I didn't react because I know that strength isn't in shouting louder, but in maintaining dignity even in the face of adversity," Thomas concluded, with a firmness that moved those present. Jessica was the next to testify. Visibly emotional, she described James's aggression and how he had repeatedly used his father's name, believing that it gave him the right to belittle others. He made it clear that to him, people like Thomas didn't have the right to occupy the same space as him. I believe his behavior reflected not only prejudice, but also the idea that money and influence are above the law and respect for others, Jessica said, looking directly at the judge. Some passengers were also called to testify. An elderly lady sitting near James recounted how uncomfortable the situation made her feel. "It was embarrassing. I've never seen someone treat another person like that. We were all embarrassed, and I wanted it to stop. Thomas was the most dignified person there. He left without complaining, even though he knew he wasn't wrong," she said, her voice trembling. Another passenger, a businessman who frequently traveled, described James as someone who clearly thought he was superior to others. He acted as if he were in control of everything and everyone, and it was clear that he believed his social status exempted him from any proper behavior. "It was a shameful scene," he added, reinforcing what everyone there already knew. When it was time for James, he stood up with an air of disdain. With a voice full of indignation, he tried to defend himself. "This is a circus. I didn't do anything but demand what's mine. First class isn't for everyone, it's for people who pay a lot to be here, and I did. This soldier should know his place," he said, desperately trying to justify the unjustifiable. He looked to his father for support, but Matthew maintained a lost look, as if for the first time he was realizing how much he had failed his son. Matthew Smith asked to speak in his son's defense, once again trying to use his influence. "Your Honor, my son made a mistake, but he was raised in an environment with high expectations. He's young, impetuous, and this shouldn't ruin his life. I ask for leniency. I'm willing to make amends for any damage caused," Matthew said, trying to convince the court that everything could be solved with money and promises of change. But by this point, everyone knew that what was at stake was much more than a simple transgression. The judge listened attentively to all the testimonies and reviewed the recordings of the incident, which confirmed James's deplorable behavior. In the end, the judge addressed the courtroom, his tone firm and unwavering. "Mr. James Smith, this court is not here to judge your social position, but your actions. No one is above the law, and the discriminatory, racist, and disrespectful attitudes you demonstrated are unacceptable. You will be sentenced to 3 years in prison and will be required to pay significant compensation to Soldier Thomas and flight attendant Jessica. Your status and your family's power do not change the fact that we are all equal before the law." James remained silent, pale, as the verdict was read. For the first time in his life, he faced a reality where his name meant nothing. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, he realized that what really mattered there was character, and that was something he lacked. Inside prison, James would understand that his last name, his privileges, and his status meant nothing. He was among people who weren't impressed by his father's power. There, he was just another person. Thomas, on the other hand, left the courtroom with his head held high. He knew he had fought not only for himself, but for all those who had ever been diminished by those who thought they could do anything. He returned to his service with the same serenity and dedication as always, knowing that his courage had made a difference. Jessica also returned to work, certain that she had done what was right, not only as a flight attendant but as a human being. The story of James and Thomas was talked about for months, becoming an example that respect and dignity are non-negotiable. Wherever James went, his name no longer carried the power he had always believed it had. For Thomas, the greatest triumph was knowing that, even in the face of adversity, he had kept his honor intact, and that was something no one could take from him. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.